I'm Carl Bradley. I'm an extension plant pathologist here. I work on diseases of field crops, so obviously wheat I'll be talking about today. I also work a lot on corn and soybean diseases as well. I've been here almost 2 years. It'll be 2 years starting July 1st of this year, so time's kind of flown. Prior to being here at UK, I was at the University of Illinois for about 8 years, and I'm happy to be here. I'm going to spend some time talking about Fusarium head blight or scab, which we sometimes refer to. But before I do that, I was just curious, what disease issues are all of you running into this year? Anything in wheat? Anybody seeing any barley yellow dwarf this year? Just a little bit? Okay. Yeah. So yeah, I'm seeing some of that too. I thought we might see a little bit more based on kind of the, I guess the warm fall we had and potential for more aphids out there, but I haven't seen anything too exciting. A little bit of stripe rust out there. Anybody seeing stripe rust? Yeah, there's a little bit. Probably depends on what variety you're growing. A lot of varieties have pretty good levels of resistance. But stripe rust really not that big of an issue this year in Kentucky. I've had a few calls about some specific fields that must have been pretty susceptible varieties, but nothing like what we saw last year. We had quite a bit of stripe rust last year, depending on what variety was being grown, and there were some susceptible ones last year that were pretty popular, both in western Kentucky and southern Illinois. I was getting a lot of calls last year about stripe rust, but not so much this year. How about scab? Anybody worried about Fusarium head blight or scab this year? A little too early to be seeing it. I could find it as I was kind of walking through these plots. I can just begin to see the beginning of the symptoms on just a few heads right now. But anybody worried about scab? Okay, I see some people saying yes. And in our last group, in fact, one of the county agents said, I'm always worried about scab every year. And I think that's probably the right attitude to have about that particular disease, because I think every year we always have the potential for scab. So let's segue into that particular disease, scab or Fusarium head blight. It's caused by this fungus known as Fusarium graminearum. And I know that unfortunately many of you have probably had lots of chances to see this disease out in the field. But just in case you forgot what it looks like, this is what you're looking at here. So these white heads out in the field. Sometimes the entire head may not be white. Sometimes it's just a partial head. You can kind of see, well, I can't see one over here. Here's one where part of the head's bleached and part of it's still green. So that's pretty typical of what we may see with scab. One thing to keep in mind is there's lots of other things that may cause white heads out in the field. There's some soil-borne fungi that can cause root rots that may cause white heads. There's some insects, in fact, that will feed on the stems and maybe cause some white heads as well. So it's always a good idea to be sure what you're dealing with. And so to be sure that it's scab, you want to take a little bit closer look at those heads, and you'll generally see this sort of a pink, salmon kind of orange discoloration that will be there between the glooms. And what you're actually looking at there is the fungus itself. It's producing thousands of spores, and when all those spores are together, you can see them with the naked eye. So you don't even really need to use a hand lens or anything like that to be able to see that. And when we have weather that's really humid and maybe kind of, if you go out in the morning and there's still dew in the field and there's scab around, some of these heads will almost just glow because of this sort of neon pink discoloration that'll be there between the glooms. So it's pretty easy to pick out. Of course, I think one of the reasons why we always have to be worried about this disease is because this fungus is always here. It's a very, if I were to be reincarnated as a fungus, Fusarium graminearum would probably be one of those that I would be at the top of my list. Okay, it's a very successful fungus, and what I mean by that is that it has a pretty wide host range. It's able to survive as a pathogen on different crops, and it's also able to survive as a saprophyte. So that means that it can just colonize debris and use that debris to live use it as a nutrient source. So this fungus is here. It particularly likes corn as well, and so this same fungus causes a couple of diseases of corn. We actually call it by a little bit different name sometimes on corn. We know it as the fungus that causes Gibberella ear rot and Gibberella stalk rot. It's the exact same fungus, but we sometimes, us pathologists and mycologists, like to confuse people and call things by different names. In the spring, if you have corn debris, and if it's been raining a little bit, it may kind of activate that fungus that's just surviving on that corn debris that's on top of the soil, and you may see these little dots there that are just kind of protruding out of that corn stalk that's on the ground. That's actually the fungus that causes scab. Okay, and this is just some fruiting bodies that it's producing. And if everything sort of hits the right timing, where we've got some rain and those are popping out of the corn stubble, and if we've got wheat that's heading and beginning to flower, and we've got that rainfall, some of those spores will be forcefully ejected from those corn stalks, and they'll land on some of those wheat heads and cause an infection. So we should always be worried, okay, about this disease. Now, weather is really the limiting factor. Okay. Kentucky's a no-till state, and we have corn in our rotation. Okay, so that means that all these fields are going to have some corn debris out there. It's great to be a no-till state for soil conservation, all the benefits you get from it. It's also great for plant pathologists. I'll be honest with you that there's a lot of corn debris out there, and a lot of these fungi that are overwintering and out there getting ready to cause diseases. So the fungus is always here. Of course, we're worried about Fusarium head blight because it can cause some yield losses, although that's not the major concern of this particular disease. If you started to rank diseases on their ability to cause actual yield loss, it would probably be down the list a little bit. There would be things like Septoria and Staganospora, leaf blotches, some of the rusts would be right up there that are really affecting those flag leaves and causing lots of yield loss. The major problems that we get from this particular disease are quality problems. So we'll have reduced test weight. This fungus will colonize those kernels and it'll infect those kernels, and sometimes it'll shrink them, shrivel them, and a lot of times those shriveled kernels will just blow out the back of the combine, and that's actually a good thing, believe it or not. We don't really want those kernels, those shrunken kernels, to take to the elevator. And the reason for that is those shrunken kernels are probably the ones that are going to have the highest levels of this mycotoxin that this fungus produces. A lot of us refer to that toxin as what? What do we call it at the elevator? Dawn is actually, yeah, that's the right one. I thought people were going to say vomitoxin. Okay, a lot of people call it vomitoxin. Deoxynivalenol is actually the name of it, which is where we come up with Dawn. As the name of that toxin. So if you take grain to the elevator, and if it's got a level of 2 parts per million Dawn or greater, that's when you're going to start to see dockage. And depending on how high the level of Dawn is, and there's other considerations here as well, the elevator may just outright reject that load. Say, nope, you can't. We're not going to buy that grain. So that's why quality, and in particular Dawn, I think, is the most important aspect of this particular disease. Okay, so when does a wheat plant become susceptible to infection by this disease? Anybody know? Okay, Catherine, when? Flowering, that's right. How can you tell a wheat plant is flowering? Okay, you got the anthers coming out of starts out at the middle part of the head, right? So how long is it susceptible? Is it only susceptible at that stage, or anybody know? It's basically susceptible up through about the soft dough stage. So it has a pretty wide range where this wheat head is susceptible to infection, but we're really most concerned about those early infections, those that are infecting there at the beginning when that wheat is starting to flower. The earlier the infection, the more time this fungus has to do damage. The more time it has to infect those kernels, shrivel those kernels, and to produce more of that Dawn. Okay, so that's generally when we're most concerned. But there's some oddball years. Apparently 2014, I guess, was one of those years. It was prior to me coming here to Kentucky. but I did hear that in that year, apparently there was not a whole lot of scab symptoms, but there was some high levels of DON in some cases. So that was kind of an oddball year for sure, but it probably had to do with environment still being suitable for infection, and we had some late infection, and although it didn't really have the damage to the kernels in regards to seeing the symptoms of head blight and the lower test weight, that fungus was able to continue to produce that DON and run into some problems that particular year. Okay, so let's move on here. Now, I talked a little bit about environment, or at least I should have. I'm getting mixed up on if I did or not. But I probably didn't. Okay, what kind of environment is favorable for infection by this fungus? Anybody know? What kind of weather? Would today be a great day for infection by the scab fungus? No. Okay, the sun's out. Those heads, you know, they're dry. You feel those are going to be dry to the touch. They were probably dry at 8:30 this morning, you know, maybe even before that. Okay, so the type of weather that's really favorable for infection is anything that would keep those wheat heads wet for a long period of time. So we're talking rainfall, we're talking cloudy weather. You know, we're not necessarily talking about we get a couple inches of rain and then the sun comes out and the wind starts blowing. That's not going to have a big effect, but it's those days where, and we've had some this year, where the clouds are out and it's just kind of spitting rain. It's not necessarily raining a whole lot, but just kind of spitting rain for a couple of days in a row. Those are the type of that's the type of weather that's really favorable. Okay, so we know quite a bit about the type of weather that's favorable for this disease, and so we've got some tools to help us forecast the risk of this disease. And let me just stop for a moment and say that a lot of research that has been conducted on this fungus and this disease has come from money from the USDA Agricultural Research Service. Back in the late 1990s, a program called the U.S. Wheat and Barley Scab Initiative was started, and that's all through the USDA ARS. And people like myself and Dave Van Santford, the wheat breeder here at UK, and lots of other researchers from across several universities get funding to work on scab. And so that's where this model came out, the Fusarium Head Blight Prediction Center. Has anybody ever visited this website to look at the risk? Okay, I see a few people raising their hand, nodding. So this is, so what you can do here is you go to this site, wheatscab.psu.edu, or you can just Google scab forecasting, it'll get you there. You can go to the state. In this case, you can pick Kentucky. And what you'll see once you do that is this Kentucky commentary, and that's me that adds that for Kentucky. And I know that all of you can, unless you're colorblind, can see some of these different colors and kind of interpret the risk. But I also, with I guess some of my experience and knowledge about the fungicides that we have available and the type of environment that we have, as well as other diseases that may be occurring, I'll try to add all that kind of information up there. And so during a wheat growing season, I'll usually give 2 or 3 updates. So not a lot, but a few during kind of that risky time of scab. So this is based on weather that occurred the previous 5 days. Okay, and you can kind of look into the future a little bit here by clicking some of these other buttons. So if it just was on 0, which is the default, it's going to give you the weather that occurred the last 5 days. It's going to give you the risk based on that. If you clicked on 72, it's going to give you the risk based on the last 2 days, but then on the forecast, the weather forecast for the next 3 days. So you can look into the future a little bit. We've done quite a bit of research looking at fungicides for control of this disease. Again, this is all funded by that U.S. Wheat and Barley Scab Initiative. And you can see back in 1995, there was research trials that began looking at different fungicides. What all these bars represent here by each state is the number of trials that have been evaluated in this uniform fungicide trials. In total, there were 309 trials from 1995 to 2013. So myself, along with a lot of help from Drs. Pierce Paul and Larry Madden, who are up at Ohio State University, used these data to develop a meta-analysis to put all these different trials together. So one of the questions we asked about it to this data set is which fungicide works the best, okay? So we had tebuconazole, which is Folicure, also known as other names, Proline, Prosaro, and Carumba. And what we're looking at here is percent control of scab. Okay, so this is the actual symptoms. The higher the bar, the better level of control, and this is all relative to our untreated checks. So you can see about 40% control of scab with Folicure, and we're getting about 50% with the other products. If Chip was up here talking about weed control, would you be happy with that level of control of weeds? 40%, 50% control? Probably not. Okay, so keep that in mind. Is with fungicides, we rarely get 100% control. That just doesn't happen with fungicides, and especially with a fungus like this that's really difficult to control. This is about as good as we can get. When we look at control of DON, the amount of mycotoxin that's in the grain, you can see that Folicure really drops off quite a bit. So it does make sense to spend a little bit more money on these other products based just on that, okay? I'm kind of running out of time. I'm going a little fast here. I want to hit this last slide. One thing we know about spraying fungicides on scab is our recommendation for a long time, and still is, to try to hit it when at Feeks growth stage 10.5.1, and that's when anthers are just starting to come out of the middle part of the head. And as researchers, when I look at that in my plot, my trigger is when we're at that stage on 50% of the heads that are out there, okay? So we looked at 3 timings, Feeks 10.5, which is heading, not yet flowering, that 10.5.1, and then 5 days after that 10.5.1, which is the green. And again, this is looking at control of the actual disease with both Prosaro and Carumba. We found that if we applied before flowering was occurring, it was really too early. We didn't get very good control. We did see that timing, that 10.5.1, that was the best timing. If we were 5 days after that, we didn't drop off that much. We did drop off a little bit. But more importantly, I think, is looking at control of DON here. And again, you can see very early, if you're early, we don't get that good a control. But if we're slightly later than that Feeks 10.5, we don't drop off very much. So this is important to remember, especially in a year like this, where we had wheat that was just getting ready to flower, and then we had, but not quite there, probably at heading in some cases, but not yet flowering, and we had this series of rainfall that was forecasted. The question was, do I go out now and spray, or do I wait? And of course, you know, it's always hard to predict what kind of weather is going to be at the other end of that rainfall. But from looking at this data, it's better to be a little bit late than a little bit early. It's best to be perfect, but if you can't be perfect, it's best to be a little bit late versus early.